Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our, I think we're on the fourth WASH Canada seminar series, or talks. We're not doing seminars, we're doing talks. And it's my great pleasure this morning to introduce our next speaker, Professor Susan Elliott. She's at the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo. I know when I came to Canada, that was back in 2011. I was already involved in WASH, like, I'm going to do WASH. I don't think WASH there's a lot going on in Canada, and there's nothing new under the sun. And Susan was doing it already, and this is an excellent kind of shift in pace from what we've been doing, because I think we've been having, the last few speakers have been mainly more technical and engineering, and WASH in its interdisciplinarity is represented by a variety of disciplines. And so I'm very grateful to have you, Susan. Good morning, and I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So now for something completely different. And I will talk a little bit about that as we go through. So I will share my screen and I will make this sized. Okay. So thanks so much for the invite, and it's been great to get to know you, Kitano, and the people that you work with at UVic, and just a little background on me, which you'll hear more about as we get going. But my first job was at the University of Victoria when I first got my PhD. So that
Welcome back.
Thank you. That was in the early 90s, from 92 to 94. And yeah, I have a very soft spot in my heart for the University of Victoria, particularly the geography department. And it was so long ago, I'll just say this, I was the first female tenure track faculty member ever hired in geography. So I'm very proud of that. So today I want to talk about from plumbing poverty to plumbing violence, water security, and gender-based violence in the global south. And, you know, as Kitano mentioned, I've been doing this for a long time. And there are some things that you can only learn when you're in the field. And you'll hear me say this, that we know that gender-based violence occurs in the context of WASH, not because of the research, but because of the stories that women tell other women. And so I've learned this over my time working in the global south, or developing countries, or LMICs, or however we want to characterize them. And so as I come to near the end of my career, I think it's about time we did some research on this. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit about me, because I'm different than many of the speakers that you've had. And I think it's really important that you know a little bit about the stuff that I do, so you know where I'm coming from. Then I want to talk a little bit about water and health, plumbing poverty, plumbing violence, and then our next steps. So I'm a medical geographer. Yesterday at the University of Waterloo, I actually had an in-person meeting with like 6 people sitting around a table. It was so surreal. It was my first time in a long, long time. To the president of the university, because our new president, who actually is a health person, wants to write a strategic plan about what the University of Waterloo is going to look like in its 100th year, which is 50 years from now. And for some reason, I'm in charge of the future of health. I'm a geographer, and I'm in the Faculty of Environment. We don't have a medical school, but we definitely have a health faculty. So I had to say, I don't know if you know why I'm here. I'm a geographer. I'm in the Faculty of Environment, but I'm a medical geographer by training. And what medical geography is the study of the distribution, diffusion, determinants, and delivery of health and healthcare. I work primarily in the area of environment and health, right? And so we used to think of health as the absence of disease. And then in 1958, the World Health Organization said, no, this is what we mean when we say health. It's more than simply the absence of disease. It's complete physical, social, and emotional well-being. Great definition, but what does that really mean? How do you know it when you see it? And then in 1986, the G7 or 8, I can't remember if we had 7 or 8 at the time, health ministers from around the world met in Ottawa, and Jake Epp was the Minister of Health in Canada at the time, and we came up with this Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. And in that Ottawa Charter, this is the definition of health that they use. And this is the one that I like: a resource for everyday living that allows us to manage, cope with, and even change our environment. I like it because it's very active. right? We have control, we have agency. Health just doesn't happen to us. Yes, it happens in a constrained environment, but it doesn't just happen to us. So then what do I mean by environment? And the students always giggle when I say this, but it's true. The environment is everything that's not me. And that's Einstein's definition of the environment. And so I talk about the social environment, the physical environment, the political environment, the economic environment, and the cultural environment. So all of these environments that are shaping our health. In terms of my research areas, I have three. The built environment is the first one. So how we construct the cities in which we live. And so we've done research on, you've heard about this walkability index thing. So we created a walkability index based on three parameters: street connectivity. So you see, we're geographers, GIS, right? You see these little street nodes here. The green ones are what are called dangle nodes. It's the end of a cul-de-sac. You can't go anywhere from there. The red ones are where the streets actually cross, and you can get to point A from point B. And so where there's more red ones, people are more likely to walk. Where there's more green ones, there's nowhere to go. So we combine the street connectivity network with residential density, which means that where there's lots of people like to go for a walk. People are more mobile outside. Where there isn't, they don't. Rural versus urban, basically. And then we combine that with land use mix. I live 3 blocks from the high street or the main street in my town, which means I can go for a walk and I can find a cafe, I can find a restaurant, I can find a library, I can find an art gallery, I can find everything I need within 3 or 4 blocks walk of where I am. If you live in a very homogeneous land use area, like all residential, you're much less likely to walk. You combine those 3 things together, get a walkability index, and you know what? You regress it against body mass index, which is a major determinant of chronic disease, which is, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and so on. And there's a 1-to-1 relationship. And we did that for Vancouver and we did it for Toronto. So the built environment and how it affects our health. The second is the socially constructed environment, how we socially construct risk. And sometimes that's environmental risk. I do a lot of stuff on food allergy. What has this got to do with food allergy? How many times have you been like, oh my gosh, I got to rush home and there's nothing for supper and I'm going to stop at the grocery store and pick up a chicken that's already cooked. And if you look at this chicken package, this is from President's Choice, which is the big Loblaws chain, right? My recollection is in the West Coast is a big Safeway world. We don't have Safeways on this side of the country. And on the East Coast, they have Sobeys, but everybody has a pre-cooked chicken somewhere. And if you look at this package, it will say to you, the only ingredients in here are chicken, salt, and water. But underneath will be a precautionary statement around food allergies, and it will say, may contain peanuts, may have come in contact with, may have been produced in a factory that also produces products with peanuts. So now all of a sudden, this peanut allergy thing has reared its head, right? Only since the early 1990s, it's very new. So where did this huge epidemic of food allergies come from? So if I said to you, what percentage of the Canadian population do you think has a food allergy? Pop that in the chat. Anybody, throw a number in the chat. What percentage of the Canadian population do you think has a food allergy? 15%, 35%, 35%, 20, 20, 10, 40, 60, 75. I know because we've collected the data and we've done this at three points in time. We're still getting numbers 20. 7.5% of the Canadian population has a food allergy. 7.5. And guess what? It's not increasing because we've done that too. We've done 3 national surveys at 3 points in time. We've done the entire country, all provinces, all territories, 7.5%. So why do we think it's 75% or 35%? It's because we go grocery shopping and we see this and there's a big may contain label on it. That's a way for companies to sort of cover themselves. The ingredient lists in Canada are regulated, which means they are law. By legislation, you have to list all the ingredients. These may contain, may have come in contact with, might have been produced in the same company as. Those are voluntary. And so they're all over the place and they drive people with food allergies crazy. It's very difficult to grocery shop if you have a food allergy. Oops. But what's interesting is when things start to leak into popular culture, right? 7.5% of the population. There's a lot worse problems going on in the world. But then we start to see in these popular television programs where people use food allergies as an excuse to not have to visit with their neighbors. In this second example, a grandfather tried to intervene when his grandson was being bullied at school. He said, "Do you want me to intervene?" And the kid said, "No, it's okay. The kid has a peanut allergy. I can take him out with a handful of trail mix." In this very famous movie, food allergies were ridiculed in the Peter Rabbit movie. And you would think, oh, a Peter Rabbit movie, isn't that cute? All these families go to see the Peter Rabbit movie. The mothers of those kids who had peanut and other food allergies went ballistic when that was made fun of in that movie. So just some other examples when you can have a chance to look at the slides about where to look at the representation of food allergies, particularly peanut allergies in popular culture. So lots of stuff happening in the social construction of the environment. And then the area that I'm going to talk about today, the physical environment. So I look at climate change, water, sanitation, and health in various parts of the world. This stuff is not making it in to popular culture. So for example, we just published an editorial in the Canadian Journal of Public Health, hot off the press just this week, myself with a virologist at the University of Montreal. Did you know that in the fall of 2021, the World Health Organization released a malaria vaccine? So few people know this because we were so absorbed in how COVID-19 was affecting our part of the world and our daily lives, and we couldn't go to the gym and we couldn't go shopping. And yet tens of thousands of particularly under fives are dying every year because of malaria. And now there's a vaccine and nobody paid any attention. So this is part of the part of the world where I spend a lot of my time when it's not a pandemic. This is Lake Victoria, second largest freshwater body of water in the world. It's got 5 countries around it. 3 of them have shorelines, so Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and then 2 are also in the basin, Burundi and Rwanda. And you can see very, very mixed use in this lake, right? So somebody's fishing primarily for tilapia. Nile perch was introduced to the lake, but they mostly catch those and export them. Kids swimming, probably washing. Up the lake, there are women drawing water from the lake for use in washing, hopefully not in consumption because the lake is heavily contaminated. And these guys standing around the lake, they're car washers. And so basically what happens is cars, will come and they'll drive into the shallow part of the lake, and those guys will stand in the lake all day and wash cars and trucks, including petrol trucks. So the lake gets heavily contaminated by that. And those guys are chronically ill with schistosomiasis because they're standing in the lake all day. So water is a major issue on a global scale. We have a water security issue. Current numbers, 844 million lack basic drinking water, 1.6 without access to adequate sanitation. But we know too that access to water is shaped by power relations. And part of that issue is that water is quintessentially a gendered issue on a global scale. It's women's responsibility to provide that water at the household level, women and girls. And then, because I'm an academic, we have theories to inform our work, and we draw on the theory of political ecologies of health. It's kind of like political economy, but here we're talking about access to resources. And so we talk about political ecology, and we frame this as a feminist political ecology because this is a gendered issue. And so as a geographer as well, I know that space and place shape gender and gender relations and resource access. And our water as a gendered resource is centered around 3 main issues. Women and girls are primarily responsible for water collection. About 2 million hours a year are spent by women and girls collecting water. Women and men have unequal participation in water governance. So women are doing all the work, but who's making the decisions? It's the male heads of households. It's the men who are the municipal councillors, and so on and so on. Women and girls' experience are disproportionate in terms of the stress of WASH insecurity. So it's women who feel the impacts. So you talk a lot about water, we talk a lot about water. But what I want to talk about is water health. And so this is a classic Bradley classification of diseases. You may know it. I'm going to put a different spin on it. So there's waterborne diseases, right? Outbreaks related to water quality. Pathogens is transmitted, sorry, there's a typo there, through contaminated water like typhoid or cholera. These pathogens survive in water, and humans generally need a low dose of them to get infected. A couple of typos there. Cholera is a very unpleasant way to die. Very, very unpleasant way to die. And yet it was romanticized. I always use this example in my classes with my students. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Love in the Time of Cholera, one of the most romantic books ever written, because two young people, it's kind of like a Romeo and Juliet story. Two young people, they want to get married. Her father says, no, you can't marry him. He's got no prospects. He's got no money. You got to marry this guy over here. So she marries this guy over here. They live together all their lives. They have kids. They grow old. Her husband dies. And she ends up on a ship in the Panama Canal in the mid-1800s, is the timeline we're talking about. And the young guy that she had been in love with, he never married. He carried a torch for her all his life. And they both end up on this ship in the Panama Canal. And there's cholera on the ship. So the ship is flying a yellow flag to indicate that it has cholera. There's cholera on the ship. And the ship cannot go into port until they can lower the yellow flag. And they can't lower the yellow flag till all the cholera is gone, which means you either have to die or get better. And in most cases, you would just die of cholera and they'd throw you overboard. And he is happier than he's ever been in his whole entire life because he finally has the woman that he loves all to himself. This is actually classified on the IMDb website. Most young people will know IMDb, where they classify movies and stuff, as the most romantic scene in a movie ever made, from Love in the Time of Cholera. But if you really want to know about cholera and how horrible it is to die from cholera, this is a fantastic book written by an investigative journalist about the story of cholera in 1858 in inner city London, and the story of Jon Snow. It's really, really, really good book. Trigger warning for the next one, because the photographs are very uncomfortable to look at. But the next type of disease is water washed, when there's not enough water and personal hygiene is compromised. Jiggers is diarrhea and of course infections of the skin, but jiggers is one of the issues that one of my colleagues in that area of Kenya on the shores of Lake Victoria that I showed you, she deals with. She's one of the top researchers in the world in this area and intervening in communities, because what happens is kids don't have water to wash and these fleas embed themselves in their skin. You're likely not going to die from jiggers, but you're going to become disfigured, be really uncomfortable. Kids, their feet are very, very painful. And so this is one of those, it doesn't even make it to the list of neglected tropical diseases, but man, it has an impact on people's quality of life and well-being. So she works with an organization called Tom's Shoes, which again, many of the young people here today will know about. Tom's Shoes is one of those organizations that has a triple bottom line. So for every pair of shoes someone buys from Tom's Shoes, they donate a pair of shoes to a developing country. And over her time working in this area, she's distributed about 15,000 pairs of shoes to these kids to protect their feet. And also so they have shoes to go to school, because it's a requirement to have shoes on your feet to go to school. And then of course there's water-based diseases. When a pathogen is transmitted through a host that lives in the water, like schistosomiasis, like those car washers I showed you at the beginning. There are gender-based impacts of this as well, which I was not even aware of till I started working with a colleague in Kenya on schistosomiasis in women, because if you're standing in the water, bathing or doing washing or whatever, the snails can embed themselves in your reproductive organs. And you can end up becoming infertile, which has huge cultural implications if you're not able to conceive or have kids. And then water related, vector borne, carried and transmitted by insects that breed in and around water, right? Like malaria and sleeping sickness, which has a huge impact in many parts of the world. The estimated burden of disease, we need to think about burden of illness in two different ways. People die, yes, but we also talk about DALYs, we call them disability adjusted life years, which means I may not be dead, but my quality of life and my well-being are tremendously impacted. I may not be able to work, or I may not be able to care for my family, and therefore might be culturally unwelcome. Bruce Ustin et al., they're the ones who constantly update us on the burden of illness. So as of 2019, it's essentially about 10% of the world's burden of illness is due to water related issues. But we see that 1.6 million deaths, 105 million disability adjusted life years are attributable to inadequate WASH. And that includes only diseases that can be quantified. So things like jiggers are not going to be quantified in there, but huge impacts. Of those, 829,000 deaths are due to diarrhea. 60% of that burden, 13% is from acute respiratory infections, 16% protein, energy, malnutrition, and so on and so on. So it's a big deal. So what's the world doing about it? Well, we had the Millennium Development Goals. There was no water goal in the Millennium Development Goals. It was subsumed under the sustainability goal. The Sustainable Development Goals, we moved from 8 goals to 17 and 169 targets, but now we have our own goal, right? Clean water and sanitation. How are we doing? Well, we're not doing very well. And last year, UN Water, which is an organization of all of the UN agencies that exist on the planet that have anything to do with water, they come together and they say, we are not going to make this unless we really pull our finger out of the dike and really step up the pace. So this is their acceleration framework that came out last year to ensure availability and sustainability management of water and sanitation for all is alarmingly off track. At the current rate of progress, the world will not reach SDG 6 targets by 2030. Rates of progress dating back to 2000, which is when we signed on to the MDGs, show we've achieved on average 1% annual progress. At least 3% annual progress is required to make those goals. So we're not doing very well. And then on March 11th, 2020, there's a global pandemic declared. And how do we stem the spread of the virus? We wash our hands, right? There's all this stuff. Follow these 5 steps to wash your hands. What do you do if you don't have any water? What do you do if you have water that's not clean? What do you do if you have dirty water and no soap? So the gaps in terms of how to address this global water security issue are, in my view, gender, plumbing, poverty, and gender-based violence. So from a gender perspective, the Joint Monitoring Program, which is under the WHO, and that is the program that monitors how we're doing in terms of water and sanitation around the world. And they have operational definitions about what's improved, what's unimproved, what's adequate, and so on. They came out with a report last year on gender, and we were quite proud because one of the papers that one of my PhD students worked on, and she's now defended, Thelma Abu, was referenced in this document. And you know how we're always getting pushed to like, make sure you do stuff that has policy implications. Well, guess what? It's in there. So we're pretty proud of that. So it talks about gender, the importance of gender. Very, very little mention of anything to do, though, with gender and violence. Pardon me. Pardon me. A couple of mentions, but only in the context of the relationship to menstrual hygiene. And then we go to the literature on plumbing poverty, which is a very, very new literature. And I apologize, I forgot to put the reference on this slide, but it's on the next slide. So this is from a paper that used US Census data to measure what proportion of the US population does not have access to complete water and sanitation. United States of America. And this is before the pandemic, right? So before we all have to wash our hands so vigorously. And they do some really interesting regression analysis. The dependent variable is plumbing completeness. So you have complete access to water, sanitation, and plumbing. Independent variables, race, income, housing type, and tenure. They did logistic regression. And then they did some spatial analysis using the Getty's was a famous spatial analytical geographer who came up with this statistic, so they named it after him. And this is what they found. So the numbers are pretty small. I'm looking at my monitor as opposed to my screen because the numbers are a little small. But you see percentage of households that are American Indian or Alaskan Native, 1.5 of the population, and yet 6.2% of those households have incomplete plumbing, right? And these differences are all statistically significant, every single one. Black is about 13%, 17%, I'm rounding, but 17% incomplete plumbing. Hispanic, same thing. By income, 1.28 of the households, 8.8 have incomplete plumbing. Mobile homes and renters, the difference, 37% of the households are renters, 51% of them have incomplete plumbing. So in short, what they found was plumbing incompleteness is spatially clustered in certain regions of the country and is clearly racialized. This is the United States of America. In Canada, 1% of our Canadian population does not have access to adequate water and sanitation and hygiene. 1%. And they are primarily our Indigenous populations. What happened in the US after March 2020 when the pandemic was declared? That number there, 90. 90 municipalities in the United States had to pass legislation to force privatized water companies to turn water back on to low-income households who had been cut off because they were too poor to pay their water bill. 90 municipalities in the United States of America, which is supposed to be the richest, most powerful country in the world. Plumbing poverty. When we start to look at violence, I started to hear stories when I was working in sub-Saharan Africa about girls and women experiencing violence in the context of simply providing water for their households or trying to relieve themselves from a sanitation perspective. This is a young girl named Patience. She was looked after by a colleague of mine, a Canadian friend of mine who started an organization called Save the Mothers, which is a maternal and child health program located just down the road from where we were working, just across the border in Mukono in Uganda. She went to get water one morning, very, very early. It was still dark outside. She was raped. She got pregnant. She didn't tell anybody. Because if you tell somebody, then maybe nobody will marry you. So it came very close to her time to have a baby. And of course, she couldn't hide it anymore. This is her baby. They're both very healthy. She's about 15 years old. I showed you Bradley's classification of diseases earlier. It was recently updated by Jamie Bartram, who used to run the Joint Monitoring Program. And it includes violence now. Injury and violence associated with water collection, but it doesn't make that link to gender. So how do we frame WASH and gender-based violence? These are cartoons that I have seen on posters in schools and in communities. So what you see is a representation of a woman being taken on her way to relieve herself in a latrine. These are posters that I saw in schools in Ghana. So you see, this is the side of a school building with a full-size giant painting of a grown man trying to take a young girl as she's heading to the latrine. In another context, I was in a school talking to the headmaster about health issues. And this is a beautiful set of latrines built for the boys and the girls at the school, and they've got a water tank. This was all paid for by UNICEF. You can see a clump of trees on the other side. And when we stood there, the headmaster told me before those latrines were put in by UNICEF, the girls and boys would go and relieve themselves in that clump of trees. And there would be adult men waiting for the girls. So how do we go about researching water security and gender-based violence? Well, we started this recently. We got funding from Oxford University and some from the University of Waterloo. But then, of course, COVID happened and our fieldwork components were limited, but we do have some data. So we started with a document review. So in the international, national, regional policy documents of these major organizations, where is water security and gender-based violence? And then we start to conceptualize what we mean by these things. We did a scoping review of the literature, and we do have some quantitative and some qualitative research. We haven't analyzed the data yet, but I'll hint at some things. So this is just one of the tables produced by my master's student, Maurice Stigoli. What he did was he collected documents, international documents on water. And then across 3 countries, Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda, he got their national documents, regional documents, and then he interviewed the heads of NGOs who deal with water in those countries, virtual interviews, to find out where water security and gender-based violence fit in. And it was basically nowhere. And this is just one example. This is international documents. So we've got the UN Water Strategy. That's the one that I talked about earlier. UNICEF, which deals with the health of and well-being of children. SDG 6 Global Acceleration Framework, eliminating discrimination, inequalities, and access to water and sanitation. And then the Strategy for Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene 2016 to 2030. And we see in the context of water, lots of mentions, sanitation, hygiene, so on and so on and so on. But when we get to gender-based violence, WASH women and girls, gender-based violence, distance that women have to travel, women and girls, very, very few mentions. And what we see is that the vast majority of mentions in the context of violence are again in the context of menstruation and only menstruation. So lots more data there, but just to give you an indication, it's not being talked about in the international or national policy documents. I'm going to skip over that part. That's the theory part. From a theoretical perspective, how we're conceptualizing this, we actually have published a paper in the journal Health and Place towards an integrated theoretical framework for understanding. And so if you want to learn more about the theory of feminist political ecologies of health, you can go to that paper. So the next step was then to say, okay, we've conceptualized it, we have theorized it, we know it exists from the stories that women tell other women and the stories that we hear in the field. What's the state of the art, right? So we go to the literature and we do a scoping review. So we go to the literature and we identify almost 11,000 records. By the time we remove the duplicates and go in and find out, which ones actually address our inclusion criteria of water security, gender-based violence, LMICs, we end up with 29 studies. Of those studies, we conceptualize the types of violence, the 4 dimensions of violence. So physical violence, which is assault by a spouse or family member, a physical altercation at the water point. So this can be, a lot of times young girls will get up very, very early in the morning to get to the lineup in the water point, so that they can get the water, get it back home and get to school on time. And they may be assaulted by older women who want to get closer to the front of the line. Stoning at defecation sites. So if you're defecating in the bush, sexual violence, sexual assault, rape, peeping, transactional sex. So that means you need water, somebody has water, they'll say they'll give you water if you perform a sexual act for them. Psychosocial violence, so shame, embarrassment, fear, or stigma. So a lot of women who are bathing in the river because there's no other opportunity for them and people are staring at them and they feel shame. They feel embarrassed, not the people who are staring at them. And then structural violence, political and economic marginalization vis-a-vis WASH access. So, women are the ones responsible for providing water to the household, and yet they don't have control over the economic resources of the household. And so it might be my job to make sure there's water, and it's going to take me a couple of hours to make the trip to the water point, wait my turn, fill up my jerry cans, and walk home. If I had a few shillings, I might be able to hire somebody to take my jerry cans on their bicycle and go get me water and bring it back. But I don't have any economic autonomy in the household. And I certainly don't have any political opportunities to, be part of the water management system. So when we look at the distribution of mentions of these different types of violence across the literature that exists, and of course it doesn't add up to 100 because there are multiple mentions. Physical violence is about 1/3. Sexual violence is a little over 1/4. Psychosocial violence is very high. So when we talk, as I talked about earlier, about health and well-being, psychosocial violence, psychosocial health impacts are just as legitimate as a physiological health impact. And psychosocial health impacts can lead to physiological health impacts, the stress of worry. So that's about 80% almost. And then structural violence, 55%. So that's what we see in the literature. So our job then is to go into the field and see what we find out in the field. We have actually completed about 2,000 surveys across Uganda, Kenya, and Ghana. And those surveys include questions about the experiences of violence in the context of securing WASH and adequate sanitation, as well as the empowerment of women in the context of water provision, water management, water governance. We haven't analyzed the data yet, so you'll have to invite me back next year, Kitano. From a qualitative perspective, we have started doing oral histories with older women to ask them, what has been your experience with water and sanitation over your lifetime as a child, as an adolescent, as a young married woman, as a mother, as an old woman? And again, we are just analyzing those data now. And I think we've been super fortunate in that we've worked in these parts of the world for a long time. So we have good relationships with people. And, we're not collecting these data. It's people on the ground who are collecting these data. And the postdoc that I'm working with who collected the oral histories, who has lived in this community for her entire life, who has a PhD from a local university, was appalled by the number of mentions by these women of psychosocial impacts of them, bathing in the lake and not having privacy and so on and so on. And the take-home message from the preliminary analysis is that every single one of these women reported structural violence in the context of provision of water and adequate sanitation in their household. Every single one. So last slide, this is my conclusion. And my students, if there's any on here, will know that I always say 3 through 6 via 5, which means Sustainable Development Goal 3 is health and well-being for all by 2030. Sustainable Development Goal 6 is clean water and sanitation for all by 2030. And in my view, we are not going to have either of those unless we first empower women, which is Sustainable Goal number 5. That's it. Happy to answer any questions people would have.
Wow, it's fantastic. I'm sending you my virtual claps. I don't want to startle anyone with my mic. Awesome. Thank you very much, Susan. Let's